Greetings and salutations. I'm Liz, and in today's video, I'll be going over my thoughts on Heathers in 1988. This dark comedy revolves around Veronica Sawyer, an intelligent teen who is part of her high school's most popular clique. This clique is comprised of Heather Chandler, Heather Duke, and Heather McNamara. Heather Chandler, being the lead of this clique, uses Veronica often to bully others against her will. This leads to where Veronica and her newfound boyfriend Jason Dean, later referred to as JD throughout the film, accidentally poison Heather Chandler and stage it as a suicide. With the synopsis out of the way, I do want to state that the reason I decided to make this video is because of how this movie, a few years or let alone a decade within the time frame before its time, it really just hit the nail on the head with how some current situations are to this day. This really includes the Columbine shooting, along with many other shootings within high schools down the line, as well as going into where a lot of teenage suicides are taking place and often being younger and younger each year. The characters that I'm mainly referring to that literally depict how today's society has certain people is JD, Veronica, and ultimately all of the adult characters within this film itself, especially with how they are in handling of the situation. So in the midst of this, I'm going to be trying to go into the movie chronologically and explain each variable of the situation in its entirety. Now, I want to say I almost threw this out as a throwaway gag. However, I realized that this is actually a small red flag into JD as a character and ultimately probably as a character study before its time as well. And the reason for this is how you have Kurt Kelly and Ram Sweeney, the senior jocks in the school that just want to have sex and ultimately call the people that they don't like, especially the guys, bags, which is a derogatory term for a homosexual, if no one knew that, but I just wanted to get that out there. JD, in retaliation to this, ends up firing blanks within the school cafeteria at these two jock fellows. However, within this frame, you see where Veronica is already out of the picture, like she doesn't really know the full story of what happened, instead of how the school portrayed it of just, oh, we're just gonna give him a suspension, no harm done, he'll just be out of school for about a week or two. However, with Veronica, with her being more so disgusted by the jocks, as the character that is to be the common sense type person within the story or the generation that is taking place, which is an actual reference to later on into the movie where her mother is like, oh, what are you having to say, Miss Voice of a Generation, or something to that example, which I know I'm paraphrasing on that, I'm sorry, and I'm stuttering up here, but to give a brief example, Veronica, really just sees this like, oh, okay, whatever, so be it, it was blanks, and the jocks are fine, they deserve the good scare for what they're doing, etc., so on. Though, back to JD, this is the first red flag that we do see into understanding his intentions that are going to be happening later on into the movie. Though, to compare this to things that are in our modern day agenda or area, we do have it where a lot of people just make fun of the school shooters in a general sense of like by way of memes or even just like racially profiling by like, oh, it's only the white guys that do it, and what do you know, JD is also white within the story and so forth and so on. However, it is really just like ultimately just joked around, not really giving into a red flag area where it's like, you should be concerned for this person. This is why I do have, if you have anyone in your family or even just friend, please go make sure they're okay into this mental health regard, because a lot of stuff does get ignored just because of meme culture or even people just ignoring it, like whatever and all that, being quite frankly desensitized to it. And I'm gonna be using the word desensitized quite a bit later on, so that's gonna be a thorough ride just to do. But as I was saying, most of the time within our society currently, most of this is just brushed upon as just memeing it or joking around with it, or just seeming as like a weird or edgy, other than actually seeing like, hey, maybe this person is dealing with some stuff or anything to that example. And to JD's character, once again, with our second red flag of his intentions, is whenever he starts to joke around with making sure that Heather Chandler gets poisoned with the drain cleaner. Of course, Veronica, being the common sense kind of person, does reject this idea and only ends up pouring milk and orange juice into a cup in order to make Heather throw up. However, Veronica ends up grabbing the wrong cup, and the cup that she grabs has the drain liquid in it. Or drain cleaner in it, sorry. Anywho, you have it where JD is about to tell her, hey, you got the wrong cup, but he subsides and follows through with actually wanting Heather to drink it. So he doesn't really say anything to warn Veronica about it because he thinks it would be funny, or it's actually what Heather deserves. After this happens, JD attempts to try to calm down Veronica as to being like, oh, it's no big deal, we'll just stage it as a suicide, and ultimately coerces her into forging a suicide note. This note eventually does get passed around during one of the class sessions within their high school. However, I do want to make a point that this is actually where the start of making sure that suicide is so popular and so cool to do, and I'm using that in a quotation format because that is the mentality that Heather Duke ends up giving off later on into the film. This is where the society, or the adults of society, comes into play with Father Ripper's speech at Heather Chandler's funeral. Originally, I was gonna chop this off as a joke until I realized how this does correlate into nowadays, especially with how even we had Trump, I think, on live television with it. I could be wrong, I know it's out there somewhere, but where he was saying, no, we need to make sure that these gruesome video games are not affecting our children when it comes to violence. And I'll probably, if I can, put a little meme here as far as what's actually going on with the boomer ideal of how this quote is. So let me go ahead and read what Father Ripper says within the funeral scene for Heather Chandler. I blame not heaven, but rather a society that tells its youth that the answers can be found in the MTV video games. Yeah, I kind of heard that, and first, yeah, I was gonna chop it off as a joke. However, even though, yes, it is kind of a joke, but I was just gonna not really take it in until I realized, like, hey, this is actually an excuse that many people put out here, and I'm gonna get into more on the why I'm saying that violence, especially within youth, is caused by the lack of parenting, other than video games or anything like that. I'm not saying that video games can't be put into someone's own mind and desensitize them from violence, because that can easily occur, especially if you don't have a parental figure. However, that is ultimately because of the lack of parenting. Like, I'm gonna get more into that in just a moment. However, after the funeral, Kurt and Ram end up making the false rumor that Veronica gave both of them a pretty serious blowjob. This also ruins Veronica's reputation within the school, but also makes JD convince her about pranking the two of them by putting them a couple miles behind the school in order for them to actually make the false rumor true. However, other than having the non-fatal bullets that JD actually was lying about, he ends up killing one of the jocks, I forgot which one, and then chases after the other because Veronica misses. Veronica realizes that they were actual bullets, not fake, and she feels betrayed and disgusted that she was lied to, but still stays with JD at this time. Once again, JD plants it as they were homosexual lovers and wanted to do a, I guess, double suicide in order to convince their love for each other because of all the homophobia that was going on at that time. So, as you can see, we already have it where JD enjoys killing people that he ultimately doesn't like. We see that these suicides, or planted suicides, are often leading to where suicide is the new craze around the school once again. You even have it where Martha Dunstock, often called Dump Truck by people who bully her within the school, where she attempted to commit suicide herself due to the fact that she clearly, because of bullying and how that was going on, wanted to take her life because of that. She got seriously, well, I wouldn't say seriously, but she ended up getting into a motorized wheelchair and also had a neck brace after the fact that she landed face first even though she was walking out into traffic in order to get run over for her suicide. Which is ultimately very disgusting and upsetting just to see this, because already from the beginning of the movie I really felt for that character in general, because you already got a sense of that was probably gonna happen, and I nearly started crying seeing that, because it's just like, no, please don't. Like, I'm glad she lived, I guess, within the movie standard or whatever, but looking on that now, you even have it where Heather Duke comes into play, where she is now the top leader of the Heathers and tries to make it where it's like, oh, it's okay, she was just trying to, be popular and failed. That is not something we really should be promoting or making fun of, but you do have people to this day that believe that kind of way. We even see where Heather McNamara ends up trying to commit suicide herself, however Veronica was able to stop her. This was ultimately because she wanted to go on a radio show and she ended up being made fun of because of that while she was trying to open up about her emotions. Now we get to where we're ultimately seeing a disconnect between JD and his father's, I guess, dynamic or relationship per se. We already know from a first part of the movie that JD's mother is out of the picture and that she died in a library after it fell down. And then we slowly get introduced to the full story where it was actually JD's dad who ended up rigging the library in order for it to explode. And about 2 minutes before it was supposed to, JD's mother did go inside and pretty much waved goodbye to him. And I kind of think from how JD and Veronica's relationship was, he was ultimately treating her like how JD's dad treated his mother. In a way where he was kind of coercing her into doing those things until she couldn't ultimately take it anymore. At least that is what I got from how that situation was. Due to all this violence revolving around JD and his dad, I'm pretty sure that JD became very desensitized to violence because of the lack of love or anything that he got from his dad. And the only thing they really, quote-unquote, had in common was the fact of their violent tendencies rather than actually bonding as father and son. I truly think that this was confirmed in the boiler room speech where JD expresses how nobody loves him, and as well as the people that he was planning on blowing up within the high school is where he was viewing as the high school as society, and how no one would truly get along unless they were in heaven, which honestly, in of itself, that is a very somewhat toxic trait just to have. However, within his point of view, you can see how he's actually thinking that with the life that he has grown up. And I'm easily to express that many, I guess you can call them shooters, or even people that would go into this deep, I would call it a deep depression. I'm not an expert, but I'm just gonna label it as such, that would go into that field of like, nobody cares if I did this, maybe I'll go with them too. You even have it at the end where JD, mostly just exactly like how most school shooters or anything of that example, or massacres or anything, he ultimately kills himself in the end as well, other than just killing people and going on about it. Even though, like, you do have the Parkland shooting where the shooter did not kill himself. He even expressed how it was a disconnect for him, and if you look like social media wise, there was already a lot of red flags already that people just ignored. So I guess that's my main point of seeing this, is like, you see a lot of people who are, I guess, like JD in the world, and this is not just to victimize or even popularize those people. This is really just to spread awareness of those people do exist, and there is a way to prevent it other than ignore it or make fun of it. To go back to the boiler room scene for just a bit longer, you do have it where he does say within his quote, and this is prefacing it, I'm not doing every single word verbatim, this is just the main points that I'm getting across. He said, "So I may be killing everyone in the school because nobody loves me. The only place different social types can genuinely get along with each other is in heaven. I can't talk. People will see that there was a school that self-destructed not because society didn't care, but because the school was society." I'm sorry I screwed up a little bit while saying that. I was reading it off a paper and blech. But anyway, though that may sound like very incel-like or even very, I guess, Joker reminiscent of the whole society kind of stuff, or kind of quotes. However, he does have a point where the school within itself is basically what a society is. You have your haves and have-nots, you have your kids that would be on top of the world, and you have the people that are on the bottom. You have all sorts of different personality types clashing, but they're still all together in one area and able to just live within that system. And ultimately, I do want to say, this is where I really think that this movie is a cult classic for a reason, versus how a lot of modern day interpretations of the same exact subject matter, like I can easily put 13 Reasons Why as an example, Like, that show didn't even express it in a way where it's actually raw. Whereas this movie, sure, it's more dramatic and it's more extreme than what you would see in reality. That's going to be anything within a movie or TV show. However, it does share light on a lot of stuff that is going on within today's generation, especially with Gen Z growing up in this world where most of the time, like, in the boomer mentality, it's always like, oh, it's because of your smartphones and your video games and all that good stuff. When in reality, it's just like, you clearly don't have time to even, like, talk to your kid or even know what's up. And that's something that a lot of people don't seem to realize these days. Like, you have a lot of fear into raising kids and all that, other than actually being a parent to them. A lot of people have to grow up fast, and that ultimately, especially, and I'm not blaming the internet for this, however, you do have things on the internet that do desensitize people from certain things, especially when it comes to things like violence or even sex or drugs or anything in that matter. It's ultimately where it's like you have even Generation Alpha coming up, and they are literally basically being raised by the internet, because that's all millennials and sometimes some Gen Z parents these days only know how to do, because of the previous generations hold onto what they've taught those kids, or not even their neglectful parenting as a whole. And I'm sorry, this sounds like one of those r/I'm 14 and this is deep kind of things, but I'm just trying to make a point of where this really, I'm surprised like a movie that is from the late 80s really spoke to me as part of my generation. That is something I can't see enough within today's media. So, yeah. Anyway, I hope y'all had a great time listening to this. If you enjoy this kind of content, maybe I'll do it more. I really like looking into some movies pretty deeply like this, especially if it's movies within this scenario, or even just movies that I like in general. So if you want to see more of that, I might as well do it, and so forth and so on. If you like this content, please feel free to like, comment, subscribe, whatever, and I'll see you next time.